Legend says Rome's greatest general, in 500 years, died a blind beggar on the streets of Constantinople, reduced to holding out a cup for coins from strangers who once cheered his name through the city gates. That's probably not literally true, but the man it's told about, a general named Belisarius, really was humiliated, stripped of his rank, and thrown in prison by the same emperor he'd spent 30 years serving without a single act of betrayal. And the reason why is the entire subject of this video. This is Law 1 of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. Never outshine the master. And I want to show you 3 versions of this law playing out, because most breakdowns of this law only tell you the obvious one. There's a version where someone deliberately oversteps. There's a version where someone does absolutely nothing wrong and gets destroyed anyway. And there's the most famous version in the whole book. The one you've probably already heard, which is going to hit different once you've seen the other 2 first. Let's start with the man who did everything right. In the year 533, the Byzantine Empire was a shrinking shadow of old Rome, and Emperor Justinian had one genuinely brilliant asset, a general named Belisarius. Over the next 2 decades, Belisarius did what should have been impossible. He crushed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa with a force a fraction the size of his enemies. He took Sicily, Naples, and Rome itself back from the Ostrogoths. At one point, the surrendering Gothic army offered him something extraordinary. They'd lay down their weapons if Belisarius would rule over them as their own emperor. He said no. He accepted their surrender in Justinian's name, not his own. That refusal should have been the safest move in history. Instead, it was already too late. Justinian had spent years watching his general win battle after battle that Rome itself couldn't win, watching soldiers, citizens, even conquered enemies speak Belisarius's name with more reverence than his own. The general's loyalty was never in question. His popularity was the problem. Justinian recalled him from Italy in what historians described as temporary disfavor, not because Belisarius had done anything wrong, but because he'd become too impressive to ignore. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you if you're the kind of person who believes hard work and integrity protect you. Being recalled wasn't the end of it. Decades later, in 562, aging and worn down, Belisarius was accused of corruption on charges most historians believe were fabricated. He was stripped of his honors and imprisoned. Justinian pardoned him a few months later, and the more dramatic beggar legend almost certainly isn't literal fact, but the core of it is true. The empire's most loyal, most talented servant spent his final years discarded by the man he'd never once betrayed. That's the accidental version of this law. Belisarius never tried to outshine anybody. He just was, undeniably, better at his job than the man above him, and that alone was enough. Now, quick pause, because if you're new here, this channel is building out all 48 of these laws one at a time, alongside deep dives on Sun Tzu and Cialdini. So, if the Belisarius story got under your skin the way it got under mine, that's exactly the kind of thing we're doing every couple weeks. Hit subscribe if you want the next one when it drops. Now let's look at the opposite kind of person entirely. Because there's a version of this law where the danger isn't your talent. It's your ambition. A few centuries earlier, under Emperor Tiberius, a man named Sejanus set out to do the exact thing Belisarius refused to do. Sejanus wasn't a general. He commanded the Praetorian Guard, essentially the emperor's personal security force, and he used that position with total precision. He identified every insecurity Tiberius carried and quietly exploited every single one, positioning himself as indispensable, as the one man the increasingly paranoid, reclusive emperor could actually trust. Over time, Sejanus became the de facto ruler of Rome in everything but title, running the empire's actual day-to-day power while Tiberius withdrew to the island of Capri. For years, this worked. Sejanus was untouchable, and everyone in Rome knew it. Then Tiberius figured out the game. The exact moment is debated, but the outcome wasn't. the emperor turned on Sejanus with total, sudden force. Sejanus was arrested, executed the same day, and in the aftermath, his own children were killed, and his political allies purged across the city. A man who had spent years carefully engineering his rise was erased in an afternoon. Here's the thing. Belisarius refused power and still lost everything. Sejanus actively grabbed for power and lost everything faster and more violently. Two completely different strategies, wildly different intentions, and the exact same ending. That's not a coincidence. That's the actual mechanism behind this law. Your master isn't measuring your loyalty or your ambition. They're measuring the gap between how visible you've become and how visible they still are. Close that gap, on purpose or by accident, and the response looks identical either way. Which brings us to the story most of you have probably already heard, because it's the one that shows up in nearly every version of this law you'll find anywhere else. I'm not going to skip it, because it's genuinely the clearest, most dramatic illustration that exists. I just want you to see it after the other two, because now you'll notice something in it you might have missed before. In 1661, Nicolas Fouquet was the finance minister of France under a 23-year-old King Louis XIV, and he'd built himself an almost unbelievable fortune managing the country's money. He commissioned a palace, Vaux-le-Vicomte, employing the era's most celebrated architect, landscape designer, and painter, the same team who would later build Versailles. And then he did something that, in hindsight, reads like an act of self-sabotage. He threw a party for the king so extravagant it's still studied today. A specially written play. A fireworks display that reportedly set part of the surrounding forest on fire from the sheer scale of it. Food and wine calibrated to overwhelm. Louis arrived, saw a private estate more magnificent than anything the crown itself owned, and left humiliated. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested. The corruption charges were almost certainly manufactured. He spent the next 20 years in solitary confinement in a fortress in the Pyrenees Mountains, and died there. Louis, meanwhile, took Fouquet's own architect, landscape designer, and painter, and built Versailles, deliberately larger, deliberately more magnificent than anything his finance minister had dared to create. Unlike Belisarius, Fouquet wasn't innocent of intent. He was absolutely trying to impress the king. And unlike Sejanus, he wasn't trying to seize actual power, just status and admiration. It didn't matter. The gap was still there. The result was still the same. 3 men. 3 completely different relationships to ambition. 1 law, applied with total indifference to their intentions. Now, Greene himself includes a reversal to this law worth knowing, because it's not actually absolute. If your master is already weak, already losing their grip on power, propping up their fragile ego stops being the safe move and starts being a waste of your own position. Belisarius, Sejanus, and Fouquet all served rulers who were secure enough to feel threatened. A dying, failing master is a different equation entirely. Sometimes, hastening their fall is the smarter play. But that's a razor's edge to walk. And getting the read wrong is exactly how you end up in a Pyrenees fortress. If you want to know exactly how power actually works when it's wielded through pure information and leverage instead of loyalty and reputation, that's where Cialdini's authority principle from our first video connects directly to this one, and it's worth a rewatch if you haven't seen it. Next time, in this series, we're heading back to Sun Tzu, going deep onto section specifically, and we'll pick this thread back up with more individual laws as we go. Drop a comment telling me which of these 3, Belisarius, Sejanus, or Fouquet, you think got the rawest deal. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we're walking through all 48 of these, one story at a time.